The August heat had already turned oppressive by the time Dr. Cornelius Lawrence's carriage rattled up the Oak Line Drive to the Ashford plantation mansion. It was just past 7 in the morning on August 17, 1847, and the physician had been roused from sleep by a frantic servant boy who could barely form coherent words through his sobbing. Something terrible had happened at the big house. Something the boy couldn't explain, wouldn't explain, his eyes wide with a terror that made Lawrence's stomach clench even before he dressed and gathered his medical bag. The first thing Lawrence noticed as he approached the columned portico was the silence. The Ashford estate, one of the grandest in Merricks Parish, Louisiana, typically hummed with activity by this hour, field hands heading to the cotton rows, kitchen smoke rising from the cookhouse, the sounds of a plantation waking to another day of brutal routine. Instead, an unnatural stillness hung over the grounds like a funeral shroud. Even the birds seemed to have abandoned the ancient live oaks, their branches draped with Spanish moss that swayed in the thick morning air without a sound. The front door stood open. Lawrence had been the Ashford family physician for 12 years, had delivered 2 of Harold Ashford's children, had treated everything from consumption to cholera in this house. He'd walked through that door hundreds of times. But he hesitated now, his hand frozen on the brass handle of his medical bag, because something fundamental had changed. The smell hit him first, a nauseating combination of vomit, excrement, and something else, something coppersweet that he recognized immediately as blood. Inside the entrance hall, he found the first body. Margaret Ashford, the plantation mistress, lay crumpled at the base of the grand staircase, her silk ball gown from the previous night's harvest celebration spread around her like a collapsed flower. Her face had frozen in an expression of confusion and agony, eyes bulging slightly, lips pulled back from her teeth. Vomit stained the front of her dress and pooled on the polished hardwood floor. Lawrence knelt beside her, pressing fingers to her neck though he already knew what he would find. Her skin was cold, waxy. She'd been dead for hours. He forced himself to move deeper into the house, his physician's training warring with a primal instinct to flee. In the parlor, he found Harold Ashford and 3 of his adult children arranged like broken dolls across the furniture. They'd died in obvious agony, bodies contorted, fingers clawed into the upholstery, faces locked in grimaces that suggested their final moments had been excruciating. The youngest, Caroline, just 17 years old, had made it halfway to the door before collapsing. She'd vomited so violently that blood vessels had burst in her eyes, leaving them shot through with red. Lawrence's hands trembled as he examined them one by one, noting the symptoms with the detached part of his mind that still functioned as a doctor. Severe gastrointestinal distress. Arrhythmia, he could tell from the way their hands clutched at their chests. Seizures, evident from the positions of the bodies and the bitten tongues. Dilated pupils. And the smell, that particular sweet acrid odor he'd encountered only once before, years ago, when a child had accidentally ingested oleander leaves and died within hours despite every treatment Lawrence attempted. But oleander poisoning didn't affect entire families simultaneously. It didn't strike down 8 people in one household overnight. Unless. The thought was forming in his mind, terrible and impossible, when he heard the thunder of hooves outside. Lawrence stumbled to the window, his legs unsteady, and saw riders approaching at full gallop. He recognized Thomas Bridgewater, owner of the neighboring cotton plantation, and Sheriff Amos Ketchum, their faces pale even from a distance. They weren't coming to help with the Ashfords. They were coming because it had happened to them too. Bridgewater nearly fell from his horse, grabbing Lawrence by the shoulders the moment he stepped onto the portico. The man's expensive coat was inside out, hastily thrown on, and his eyes held a wildness that Lawrence had never seen in the normally composed plantation owner. "My family," Bridgewater gasped. "My wife, my brother, his wife, their children, all of them. And not just us. The Hendersons sent word an hour ago. The Kavanaghs. The Weatherfords. Jesus Christ, Lawrence, the whole goddamn parish." Sheriff Ketchum dismounted more slowly, his weathered face gray as ash. "Got riders coming in from every direction. Same story everywhere, families who went to the harvest celebration last night, all sick or dead by morning. We're talking dozens of households, document. Maybe more. The three men stood in the suffocating heat, the magnitude of what they were hearing slowly crystallizing into something comprehensible. The harvest celebration. The annual gathering that brought together every plantation family in Merricks Parish for a communal feast, a tradition dating back 20 years. 268 people had attended the previous night's celebration. Lawrence knew because the Merricks Gazette had printed the expected attendance in anticipation of the event. 268 of the parish's wealthiest and most powerful citizens, all gathered in one place, all eating from the same communal feast. "We need to get to the parish commons," Lawrence said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's where the food was prepared. That's where this started. They rode hard through the morning heat, picking up more riders as they went, plantation owners who'd survived, overseers, a handful of merchants from town who'd attended the celebration with their families. Each man brought the same horrific testimony. The Hendersboro estate, 9 dead, including Judge Bartholomew Hendren and his entire family. The Kavanaugh plantation, 12 dead, with another 6 in critical condition. The Weatherford property, the patriarch Samuel Weatherford had watched his wife and 3 daughters die before his eyes, powerless to help them, before he himself collapsed and was found by servants at dawn, barely clinging to life. By the time they reached the parish commons, where the remnants of last night's celebration still stood in grim tableau, tables laden with half-eaten food, decorative bunting hanging limp in the still air, fiddles and guitars abandoned mid-song, Lawrence had compiled a mental tally that made his blood run cold. If the pattern held across all the families who'd attended, they were looking at the largest mass casualty event in Louisiana history. Possibly in the entire South. The preparation tent still stood at the edge of the commons, and Lawrence approached them with a sense of dread so profound it felt like drowning. These canvas structures, erected specially for the celebration, had housed the cooking operations the day before. The enslaved people who'd prepared the feast had worked here under the supervision of Delphine, the Ashford plantation's head cook, a woman Lawrence had known for years as quiet, competent, unremarkable. Inside the largest tent, he found the cooking implements still laid out, massive iron pots, serving dishes, utensils. And there, in the corner, partially hidden beneath a folded cloth, a collection of ceramic jars that hadn't been there when Lawrence had stopped by the previous afternoon to check that everything was sanitary. He approached them slowly, as if they might explode, and carefully lifted one to his nose. The smell was faint but unmistakable. Oleander. Not the raw plant, but something concentrated, reduced, refined. Someone had been cultivating and processing oleander for months, extracting the cardiac glycosides in quantities sufficient to poison hundreds of people. The knowledge required, the planning, the coordination, this wasn't an accident or a spontaneous act. This was premeditated on a scale that defied comprehension. "Doc." Sheriff Ketchum's voice came from behind him. "What is it?" Lawrence turned, holding the jar, and saw that a crowd had gathered, 30 or 40 men now, all survivors or relatives of victims, all looking to him for answers. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words died in his throat as he looked past them and saw something that made his skin prickle with primitive fear. At the edge of the commons, in perfect silence, stood what looked like every enslaved person from every plantation in the parish. They'd gathered without anyone noticing, maybe 100 of them, just watching. Their faces were blank, unreadable, but there was something in their collective stillness that spoke louder than any words. They knew. They'd known before the white men arrived, before the bodies were discovered, before the scope of the catastrophe became clear. And in that moment, Lawrence understood that what had happened here wasn't just murder. It was rebellion. It was warfare. It was 268 of the parish's most powerful white citizens, plantation owners who controlled thousands of acres and hundreds of enslaved human beings, men who sat in the state legislature and appointed judges and sheriffs, women who ran the social machinery of Louisiana's plantation aristocracy, all struck down in a single coordinated attack. Bridgewater had moved to stand beside Lawrence, and his voice when he spoke was barely audible, meant only for the doctor's ears. "If word of this gets out, Tom, if people learn that slaves coordinated something like this, every plantation from here to Virginia will burn. There'll be uprisings everywhere. They'll kill us in our sleep." Sheriff Ketchum nodded slowly, his hand resting on his pistol. "We need to get a count of the dead and dying. We need to identify everyone involved. And then—" He paused, his jaw working. "Then we need to decide what story leaves this parish." Lawrence looked down at the jar in his hands, at the concentrated poison that represented months of planning and an intimate knowledge of exactly who would be at that celebration and what they would eat. He thought of Delphine, who'd served his own family dinner countless times, who'd smiled and nodded and played the role of the loyal servant while secretly cultivating the means to kill them all. He thought of the other conspirators, because there had to be others, this couldn't have been accomplished by one person alone. He thought of how carefully they must have planned, how patiently they must have waited, how they must have looked their enslavers in the eye day after day while knowing what was coming. And he thought of what would happen next, because in that moment, standing in the morning heat with the evidence of mass murder in his hands and a crowd of desperate, terrified white men around him, he knew with absolute certainty that the truth of this day would never see the light of history. The powerful didn't allow their own deaths to become rallying cries for their enemies. They didn't let themselves become cautionary tales. They would rewrite this morning, bury these bodies under lies, and hunt down everyone responsible with a brutality that would itself need to be hidden. By noon, the full scope of the catastrophe had been confirmed. 143 dead. 87 in critical condition, many of whom wouldn't survive the week. 38 survivors who'd eaten sparingly or been lucky enough to receive smaller doses. 268 people were poisoned. The largest act of coordinated resistance by enslaved people in Louisiana history, executed with a precision that suggested military planning. And as the sun climbed higher, turning the parish commons into a furnace, the survivors began to gather in tight, urgent clusters, making decisions that would echo through the decades. Because this couldn't be allowed to stand. Not the act itself, and certainly not the knowledge of what had been done. History would need to be adjusted. Records would need to disappear. And the people responsible would need to be found and dealt with in ways that left no witnesses, no documentation, no trace beyond the whispered warnings that would pass between enslaved people for generations. This is what happens when you rise up. This is what they do to you. This is why the story of Merricks Parish was never allowed to be told. Before we continue with what happened next, I need you to do something. This story was deliberately buried for 178 years. The people who orchestrated this cover-up wanted it forgotten forever. By watching this video, you're helping to finally bring this truth to light. Hit that subscribe button right now, and leave a comment below telling me what you think about what you've just learned. Should this story have stayed buried? Or do we have an obligation to remember what was done, both the rebellion and the erasure? Your engagement helps push this story to more people who need to hear it. Now, let's talk about how this conspiracy was planned, because what happened in the 6 months leading up to that August night was just as chilling as the poisoning itself. 6 months before the harvest celebration, on a cold March evening in 1847, Delphine stood in the kitchen of the Ashford plantation mansion and washed blood from her hands. Not her own blood. Her son's blood. Marcus had been 16 years old, tall and bright-eyed, with a hunger for knowledge that Delphine had tried desperately to suppress because she knew where that hunger led. But Marcus had been caught with a book, a simple primer on reading that he'd somehow acquired from a sympathetic merchant's son in town. For that crime, for the audacity of wanting to read, he'd been whipped in the plantation square where everyone could see, enslaved and free alike, a demonstration of what happened when property forgot its place. The whipping alone would have been survivable. Delphine had endured worse herself over her 43 years of enslavement. But Marcus had made the fatal mistake of looking Harold Ashford directly in the eyes during the punishment, had refused to lower his gaze, had maintained a dignity that the plantation owner found intolerable. So Ashford had ordered the whipping to continue beyond the usual limits, beyond what flesh could endure, until Marcus collapsed in the dirt and didn't rise again. They'd left his body there for 2 days as a warning before allowing Delphine to bury him in the plot reserved for enslaved dead, unmarked graves and unconsecrated ground beyond the property's edge. Something had broken inside Delphine that night as she dug her son's grave alone by lantern light. Not her spirit, that would have been easier, a clean snap that left her hollow but functional. What broke was subtler and infinitely more dangerous. It was the fragile mechanism that had allowed her to survive 4 decades of bondage, the internal governor that whispered, "Stay quiet, stay alive, wait for freedom that might never come." That voice fell silent in the dark beside her son's grave, and in its place rose something cold and patient and absolutely certain. She began walking at night. The Ashford plantation bordered thick cypress swamps that the white overseers avoided after dark, terrain they considered treacherous and haunted. But Delphine had been born in these Louisiana lowlands and knew the safe paths through water and mud, knew where the solid ground lay beneath deceptive surfaces. More importantly, she knew that others walked these paths too, enslaved people from neighboring plantations, moving through the darkness to visit loved ones on other properties, to trade information, to maintain the invisible networks that connected them despite their masters' attempts at isolation. On her 3rd night walk, she found Tobias. He was the stable master at the Hendersboro estate, a man in his 50s with scarred hands and careful eyes. They'd known each other peripherally for years through the social occasions when enslaved servants from different plantations crossed paths. He'd heard about Marcus, everyone had heard, the story spreading through the underground network faster than any newspaper could print it. Tobias had also lost a child, a daughter sold away to a cotton plantation in Mississippi 5 years earlier, and he understood the particular species of grief that came from being powerless to protect your own. They talked for 2 hours that first night, standing in ankle-deep water while night herons called overhead. Delphine didn't reveal her purpose immediately, just listened as Tobias catalogued the casual cruelties of the Hendersboro estate, the arbitrary violence that defined their existence. But before they parted, she asked him a simple question: if there was a way to strike back, truly strike back, would you take it even if it meant your own death? Tobias had looked at her for a long moment, and then nodded once. "I would," he said. "God help me, I would." Over the next month, the circle expanded carefully. Delphine moved through the networks with the patience of someone building something that couldn't afford a single weak link. She found Verity, a house servant at the Kavanaugh plantation who'd watched the master's eldest son rape her sister and then sell the resulting child before it was weaned. She found Isaiah, who worked the Bridgewater cotton fields and bore the scars of countless whippings across his back, each one administered for failing to meet impossible quotas. She found Ruth, who'd been forced to wet-nurse white children while her own infant starved because her milk was considered her owner's property to allocate as he saw fit. Each person she approached had reached their own breaking point, had crossed some internal threshold where survival no longer seemed preferable to resistance. And each understood that what Delphine was proposing wasn't a fantasy of escape or a small act of sabotage. This was something larger, something that would echo through history if they could accomplish it. They would strike at the entire power structure of Merricks Parish simultaneously, would demonstrate that enslaved people weren't passive victims but human beings capable of coordinated warfare against their oppressors. The plan crystallized slowly through April and May. Delphine's position as head cook for the Ashford plantation gave her a unique advantage. She was responsible for catering the major social events of the parish, including the annual harvest celebration. She knew the menu weeks in advance, knew which dishes would be prepared in what quantities, knew the timing of every element of the feast. More crucially, she had access to all the plantation kitchens in the parish through her catering responsibilities, and nobody questioned her movements when she arrived to oversee food preparation or coordinate with other cooks. The poison itself required research that would have been impossible for most enslaved people, but Delphine had advantages there too. She'd spent decades learning herbal remedies and folk medicine, knowledge passed down from her grandmother who'd been brought from West Africa and understood plants in ways that white doctors dismissed as superstition. Oleander grew wild throughout Louisiana, beautiful pink and white flowers that adorned plantation grounds as ornamental shrubs. The white families who planted them knew vaguely that the plant was toxic. Children were warned not to eat the flowers or leaves, but few understood the true potency of its cardiac glycosides when properly extracted and concentrated. Delphine began cultivating oleander in a hidden clearing deep in the swamp, transplanting specimens and tending them with care. She experimented with extraction methods, boiling the leaves and flowers down to concentrated oils, testing small amounts on the plantation's livestock when she could do so without arousing suspicion. A chicken that ate oleander-laced feed would die within hours, its heart rhythm disrupted until it simply stopped. A hog given a larger dose would seizure and vomit before collapsing. The symptoms were consistent, predictable, and most importantly, the poison was virtually tasteless when properly prepared. By June, Delphine had refined her process. She'd learned that oleander concentrate could be mixed into rich, strongly flavored dishes without detection: gumbo with its complex spices, cornbread with molasses, sweet potato pie heavy with cinnamon and nutmeg. She'd calculated dosages based on her livestock experiments, understanding that she needed enough to be lethal but not so much that people would taste something wrong and stop eating immediately. The poison needed to work slowly enough that victims wouldn't connect their symptoms to the meal until it was too late for intervention. The conspiracy expanded to include 17 people by July, each one carefully vetted, each one entrusted with specific responsibilities. Tobias would ensure that no warning reached the White families, that any suspicious conversations would be intercepted. Verity would gather intelligence about who would definitely attend the celebration and who might be absent, allowing them to adjust quantities. Isaiah would maintain the supply lines, moving concentrated oleander between plantations using routes through the swamps that the overseers didn't know existed. Ruth would handle the actual integration of the poison into the food on the night of the celebration, her steady hands and unreadable expression making her perfect for the task. They met every 2 weeks in the swamp clearing where Delphine cultivated her oleander plants, always after midnight, always with scouts posted to warn of approaching overseers. They refined every detail of the plan, identifying potential complications and developing contingencies. What if someone got sick before the main course and raised the alarm? They would claim a bad oyster in the appetizers, something isolated and explainable. What if a white person entered the preparation tents during the poisoning itself? The women working there would simply be stirring pots, adding spices, doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. The oleander concentrate would be hidden in ordinary spice containers, indistinguishable from cayenne or paprika. But the most crucial element was the silence that would need to follow. Delphine understood that they couldn't escape. The moment the poisoning was discovered, suspicion would fall on everyone who'd prepared the food. They would be hunted, tortured, killed. There was no version of this plan that ended with their survival. What mattered was that they accomplished the act itself, that they demonstrated that enslaved people could coordinate and execute an attack of this magnitude, that they made the white families of Merricks Parish pay in blood for the decades of violence and degradation they'd inflicted. On the night of August 15, the day before the harvest celebration, the conspirators met one final time. They stood in a circle in the swamp darkness, these 17 men and women who decided that death with dignity was preferable to another day of enslavement. Delphine looked at each face, Tobias with his scarred hands, Verity with her quiet fury, Isaiah who told her he'd been ready to die for years and was grateful to finally have a purpose for it, Ruth who'd kissed her remaining children goodbye that morning knowing she'd never see them grow up. Tomorrow night, Delphine said, her voice barely above a whisper, we become more than what they made us. We become the thing they fear most, people who fight back. They'll kill us for this. They'll erase us from history if they can. But somewhere, somehow, someone will remember that we refused to die quiet. That we made them pay. They clasped hands in the darkness, these 17 conspirators bound by shared trauma and shared purpose, and then dispersed into the night to prepare for what would come. Delphine returned to the Ashford plantation kitchen and began the final preparations, checking her supplies, reviewing her dosage calculations one last time, mentally rehearsing every step of the next day's process. She thought briefly of Marcus, of the boy who'd wanted nothing more than to read, whose murder had set all of this in motion. Tomorrow night, she would avenge him. Tomorrow night, 268 of Merricks Parish's most powerful white citizens would pay for every whipping, every rape, every child sold away, every dignity stripped and every humanity denied. Tomorrow night, everything would change. The sun hung low over Merricks Parish on August 16, 1847, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood as families began arriving for the harvest celebration. Carriages lined the approach to the parish commons, elegant vehicles carrying men in fine coats and women in their best silk gowns, children scrubbed clean and reminded to mind their manners. This was the social event of the season, the annual gathering where plantation aristocracy celebrated another year of prosperity built on cotton and human suffering. The air smelled of magnolia blossoms and the rich, dark earth that had made them all wealthy beyond measure. In the preparation tents at the edge of the commons, Delphine moved through the organized chaos with the calm authority of someone who'd orchestrated dozens of these events. 20 enslaved women worked under her direction, chopping vegetables, stirring massive iron pots of gumbo that bubbled over open fires, pulling cornbread from Dutch ovens, arranging serving platters with the kind of artistry that would never be credited to them. To any observer, this was simply another catering operation, the invisible machinery that allowed white families to enjoy their leisurely celebration without considering who'd spent 14 hours preparing it. But Delphine's hands were steady for a different reason as she moved between cooking stations. In her apron pocket, wrapped in cloth, were 6 small ceramic containers that appeared identical to the spice jars arranged on the preparation tables. Inside each one was concentrated oleander extract, reduced and refined over months until a single tablespoon contained enough cardiac glycosides to kill a grown man. She'd calculated the dosages with meticulous precision, not enough to taste, not enough to cause immediate symptoms, but more than enough to be lethal once the poison reached the bloodstream and began disrupting heart rhythms. Ruth worked the gumbo station, her dark hands moving with practiced efficiency as she stirred the massive pot that would feed over 100 people. When Delphine passed behind her, she palmed one of the ceramic containers from her apron and slipped it to Ruth without breaking stride. To anyone watching, it looked like a simple exchange of spices, a head cook ensuring the seasoning was correct. Ruth waited 30 seconds, glancing around the tent with casual disinterest, then uncorked the container and tipped its entire contents into the gumbo. The oleander concentrate dissolved instantly into the rich, dark liquid, indistinguishable from the dozen other spices that gave the dish its complex flavor. Verity handled the cornbread, pulling golden loaves from the ovens and slathering them with honey butter that had been infused with oleander extract the previous night. The poison integrated seamlessly into the fat, and the honey masked any residual bitterness. Isaiah's wife, Patience, worked the dessert station, carefully adding measured amounts of the concentrate to the sweet potato pies, where cinnamon and nutmeg would overwhelm any trace of the poison's presence. Every dish that would be served communally received its measured dose, not the individual plates that might be traced to specific cooks, but the shared serving bowls from which everyone would take portions. As twilight deepened into night, the celebration began in earnest. Long tables had been arranged in the commons, decorated with late summer flowers and lit by hundreds of candles in glass hurricanes. The plantation families settled into their seats with the comfortable confidence of people who'd never questioned their right to gather like this, who'd never imagined that the hands preparing their food might belong to people who wished them dead. Judge Bartholomew Hendren sat at the head table with his wife and 4 children. Harold Ashford and his family occupied places of honor nearby. The Kavanaghs, the Bridgewaters, the Weatherfords, every family of consequence in Merricks Parish represented, 268 people arrayed in their finest, ready to feast. The first course arrived at 7:30, the poisoned gumbo served in china bowls, rich and aromatic, exactly as it should be. Delphine watched from her position near the preparation tents as spoons dipped into bowls, as people tasted and nodded approval, as conversations flowed around mouthfuls of the food that would kill them. Her face remained composed, the mask she'd worn for 4 decades firmly in place, but inside she felt something like peace settling over her for the first time since Marcus died. This was happening. After months of planning, after all the risk and fear and careful coordination, this was actually happening. The cornbread followed at 8 o'clock, passed from hand to hand down the long tables, everyone breaking off pieces and soaking up the last of their gumbo with the poisoned bread. Children ate enthusiastically, their parents encouraging them to try everything, to appreciate the fine meal that had been prepared. Musicians had begun playing, fiddle and guitar creating the soundtrack for what would become a mass execution, and some of the younger guests were already dancing between courses, working up appetites that would ensure they ate more. By 8:30, the main courses arrived: roasted pork that had been basted with oleander-infused glaze, collard greens cooked with fatback that carried its own dose of poison, more cornbread because the first batches had been so popular. The communion of death continued, forks and knives scraping against china, wineglasses refilled, toasts offered to prosperity and friendship and the southern way of life that ground human beings into profit margins and called it civilization. Delphine had calculated that symptoms would begin manifesting approximately 2 hours after ingestion, giving the cardiac glycosides time to be absorbed through the digestive system and begin accumulating in heart tissue. At 9:45, she noticed the first signs. Margaret Ashford, seated near the center of the main table, put down her fork and pressed a hand to her stomach. Her face had gone slightly pale, and she leaned toward her husband to say something Delphine couldn't hear. Harold waved dismissively, probably attributing his wife's discomfort to overeating or the heat. But within minutes, others were showing similar symptoms. Samuel Weatherford excused himself from the table, his gait unsteady as he headed toward the privies. Caroline Ashford, the 17-year-old daughter, complained of nausea to her mother. 3 tables away, Judge Hendren's eldest son pressed fingers to his neck, his face confused as he felt his pulse racing irregularly beneath the skin. The symptoms were subtle at first, easy to dismiss as individual digestive issues or too much wine, but they were spreading through the gathering like ripples across water. By 10:15, the first person vomited. One of the Kavanaugh cousins, a man in his 30s, stood abruptly from his seat and doubled over, retching violently onto the manicured grass beside the tables. His wife rushed to help him, but before she could reach his side, she too was overcome by waves of nausea. Then it was 3 people vomiting, then 6, then a dozen. The careful social order of the celebration dissolved into chaos as people abandoned their seats, some trying to help the sick, others backing away in confusion and growing fear. Judge Bartholomew Hendren stood to call for order, to demand that someone fetch Dr. Lawrence, but the words died in his throat. His face went gray, eyes widening as his heart rhythm stuttered and jumped in his chest. He raised one hand as if to clutch at something invisible, and then collapsed face first onto the table, sending china and crystal crashing to the ground. His wife screamed. Children began crying. And suddenly everyone was trying to stand at once, trying to flee or help or understand what was happening, but their legs wouldn't cooperate because the poison had reached critical concentrations and was now shutting down the electrical systems that kept hearts beating in coordinated rhythms. Harold Ashford made it 3 steps from his chair before his knees buckled. He went down hard, gasping, his hands clawing at his chest as his heart attempted to beat but could only manage irregular spasms. Around him, the harvest celebration had transformed into a tableau of horror, bodies collapsing, people convulsing, the sounds of vomiting and screaming and desperate prayers filling the night air. The candles still burned in their glass hurricanes, illuminating a scene that belonged in a medieval painting of hell rather than a Louisiana parish commons. Margaret Ashford crawled across the grass toward her husband, leaving a trail of vomit behind her, but she only made it halfway before her own heart gave out. Their daughter Caroline had collapsed near the dessert table, blood streaming from her nose where vessels had burst from the strain of vomiting. The Hendren children, all 4 of them, were seizing simultaneously, their small bodies jerking against the ground while their parents lay motionless nearby. 268 people, and every single one of them was dying or watching others die, understanding in those final moments that this wasn't accident or illness but deliberate murder. From her position at the preparation tent, Delphine watched it all unfold with the calm detachment of someone witnessing inevitable justice. The screaming didn't move her. The sight of children dying didn't shake her resolve. These were the same families who'd watched enslaved children sold away from their mothers without a flicker of conscience, who'd ordered whippings and rapes and murders as casually as they'd ordered tonight's menu. What was happening to them now was a reckoning measured in the currency they'd dealt in for generations, human suffering and violent death. Beside her, Ruth whispered, "It's done." The other conspirators had gathered at the edge of the commons, knowing that running would only delay the inevitable. They stood together in the darkness beyond the candlelight, watching the aristocracy of Merricks Parish die in the dirt, watching everything they'd planned come to fruition. Some of them were crying, but not from regret. These were tears of relief, of purpose fulfilled, of knowing that for once, just this once, they'd been the ones with power over life and death. By 11 o'clock, the screaming had mostly stopped. Bodies lay scattered across the commons like broken dolls, some still twitching as their hearts made final, futile attempts to beat. A few survivors stumbled through the carnage, calling names, checking pulses, their minds unable to process the scale of what had occurred. And in the preparation tent, Delphine carefully removed her apron, folded it with the same precision she'd used for everything tonight, and waited for what would come next. She'd achieved what she set out to do. Marcus was avenged. And now, she would pay the price. Dawn broke over Merricks Parish on August 17, 1847, revealing a scene that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The parish commons, so elegant just 12 hours earlier, had become an open-air morgue. Bodies still lay where they'd fallen, some contorted in their final agonies, others sprawled peacefully as if they'd simply fallen asleep. Survivors moved through the carnage like ghosts, checking loved ones who might still be saved, covering the dead with tablecloths and decorative bunting, their movements mechanical and numb with shock. Dr. Cornelius Lawrence had been working through the night, moving from victim to victim with increasingly desperate attempts at treatment. He'd administered emetics to induce vomiting, given activated charcoal to absorb remaining poison, tried every remedy in his medical arsenal. But oleander poisoning had no antidote. Once the cardiac glycosides reached sufficient concentration in the bloodstream, there was nothing he could do except watch people die. By sunrise, he'd tallied 143 confirmed deaths. Another 87 victims clung to life in various states of distress, their heart rhythms erratic, their bodies racked by continuous vomiting and diarrhea. The prognosis for most of them was grim. 38 people had survived with relatively minor symptoms, those who'd eaten sparingly, who'd arrived late and missed the most heavily poisoned dishes, or who'd simply gotten lucky with smaller doses. These survivors now gathered in tight clusters around the commons, their faces reflecting a mixture of grief, terror, and something else, a dawning understanding that what had happened here carried implications far beyond personal tragedy. Thomas Bridgewater, who'd lost his wife and brother but survived himself, was the first to articulate what others were thinking. If word of this spreads, he said to the assembled group, his voice hoarse from screaming, if people learn that slaves coordinated an attack of this magnitude, every plantation from here to Virginia will face uprisings. They'll realize it can be done. Sheriff Amos Ketchum nodded grimly. He'd lost his own wife in the poisoning, but his lawman's instincts were already calculating the larger implications. We need a story, he said. Something that explains the deaths without revealing what actually happened. And we need it before writers start spreading news to neighboring parishes. The discussion that followed would determine how history remembered, or failed to remember, the events of that night. It happened in hurried conversations throughout the morning, but by 10 o'clock, the surviving plantation owners, Sheriff Ketchum, and Dr. Lawrence had gathered in the Hendersboro estate drawing room for a formal meeting. Also present was Nathaniel Pierce, editor of the Merricks Gazette, and Marcus Turnbull, a representative from the Louisiana governor's office who'd arrived at dawn after receiving an emergency dispatch. Turnbull spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of state authority. Gentlemen, I understand your impulse to seek justice for what happened here. But I need you to understand the broader context. We have over 600,000 enslaved people in Louisiana. If they learn that 17 conspirators successfully poisoned nearly 300 white citizens, the psychological impact alone could trigger widespread rebellion. We'd be looking at a security crisis that could destabilize the entire South. Dr. Lawrence, exhausted and covered in the blood and vomit of patients he'd failed to save, shook his head. You're asking us to pretend this didn't happen? To let the people responsible escape justice? No one is escaping justice, Turnbull said coldly. But the justice will be administered quietly, and the official record will reflect a different cause of death. I'm proposing we attribute this to a cholera outbreak, exacerbated by contaminated well water at the Commons. The room erupted in protests, but Turnbull raised his hand for silence. Cholera is endemic in Louisiana summers. It's plausible. It explains the sudden onset, the gastrointestinal symptoms, the high mortality rate. And crucially, it doesn't inspire copycat attacks across the South. Nathaniel Pierce, the newspaper editor, leaned forward in his chair. The Gazette has already set tomorrow's type with preliminary reports of a mysterious illness at the celebration. If we're committing to the cholera narrative, I need final confirmation today so I can adjust the story before we print. I need to pause here because what you're witnessing is the moment when truth becomes erasure, when the powerful decide which version of history survives. This meeting in the Hendersboro drawing room, where men covered in their families' blood agreed to lie about how they died, is how atrocities get buried for centuries. If this story is making you feel anything, anger, disgust, a sense that you're finally seeing behind the curtain of official history, then you need to subscribe right now and leave a comment. Tell me, do you believe there are other mass atrocities that were successfully covered up? What else might we not know about? Your engagement is the only thing that keeps stories like this from being buried again. Now, let's continue with what they decided in that room, because it gets so much worse. Sheriff Ketchum was nodding slowly, the calculation visible in his eyes. It could work. We'd need to control the narrative strictly, no conflicting reports, no loose ends. Every doctor, every surviving family member, everyone who knows the truth would need to maintain the story. And the conspirators? Bridgewater asked, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. What happens to them? Turnbull's expression didn't change. They'll be dealt with. Quietly. No trials, no public executions that would draw attention. They'll simply disappear, and the enslaved population will understand what happened to them through whispers and warnings. That's how you maintain control, not through public spectacle, but through private horror that everyone knows about but no one can prove. The men in that room, men who just lost wives, children, parents, siblings, looked at each other and saw the truth reflected in their collective grief. They could demand public trials, could hang the conspirators in the parish square, could make a spectacle of justice that would satisfy their rage. But doing so would require admitting what happened, would require acknowledging that enslaved people had successfully coordinated the largest mass murder in Southern history. The story would spread. Other enslaved people would see it as inspiration rather than warning. The fragile system of control that their entire economy depended on would fracture. One by one, they agreed. The official story would be cholera. Dr. Lawrence would sign death certificates attributing the deaths to acute cholera infection. The Merricks Gazette would print a front-page story about the tragic outbreak, warning other parishes to check their well water and practice proper sanitation. Letters would be sent to newspapers in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Natchez, all conveying the same narrative. The governor's office would issue a statement expressing condolences and promising aid for the affected families. And the parish records, the detailed accounts of what had actually happened, would be quietly disappeared. Nathaniel Pierce agreed to remove specific pages from the Gazette's archives, leaving a convenient gap in the historical record. Dr. Lawrence's personal notes on the oleander poisoning would be destroyed. The official parish ledgers for August 1847 would have critical days simply missing, the pages carefully removed and burned. Every physical trace of the truth would be methodically erased. The meeting lasted 3 hours, and by its conclusion, the cover-up had been planned with the same meticulous attention to detail that Delphine had used to plan the poisoning itself. They divided responsibilities. Turnbull would coordinate with the governor's office and ensure state-level compliance. Pierce would control the newspaper narrative. Sheriff Ketchum would handle the disposal of the conspirators. Dr. Lawrence would falsify medical records. And the surviving plantation owners would maintain absolute silence, would take the truth to their graves, would never speak of what really happened even to their own children. Before they dispersed, Turnbull delivered one final warning. Gentlemen, if even one of you breaks ranks, if this story leaks in any form, it will undermine everything we're trying to accomplish. You're not just protecting your own interests, you're protecting the entire Southern economic system. The lives of your families, your fortunes, your way of life, all of it depends on this story staying buried. By noon, the machinery of erasure was in motion. The Merricks Gazette published an emergency edition with the headline, "Tragic Cholera Outbreak Claims 143 Lives at Harvest Celebration." Dr. Lawrence began signing death certificates, each one listing acute cholera infection as cause of death, his hands steady despite the lie he was inscribing into official history. Messages went out to neighboring parishes, warning of the contaminated well at the commons and advising strict sanitary precautions. And in the slave quarters of every plantation in Merricks Parish, Sheriff Ketchum's deputies began making arrests. They came in the night, pulling people from their beds, separating the identified conspirators from the general population. Delphine was taken first, dragged from the Ashford plantation without explanation. Then Tobias from Hendersboro. Verity from the Kavanaghs. Isaiah from Bridgewater. One by one, all 17 conspirators were rounded up and taken to an isolated barn on the outskirts of the parish, far from any prying eyes. The barn had been prepared specifically for what would come next. Heavy chains bolted to the support beams. Iron manacles. Tools arranged on a table with the precision of a surgeon's implements, but designed for a very different purpose than healing. By nightfall on August 17, less than 24 hours after the poisoning, all 17 conspirators were secured in that barn, and the survivors of Merricks Parish's plantation aristocracy were preparing to exact a revenge that would itself need to be hidden from history. Because what they were about to do to Delphine and the others couldn't be recorded in any official document. It couldn't be witnessed by anyone who might speak of it later. It could only be whispered about in slave quarters for generations to come, a cautionary tale about what happened to those who dared strike back, a horror story designed to ensure that no one ever attempted something like this again. The barn stood in a clearing 3 miles outside Merricks Parish proper, surrounded by dense cypress forest that muffled sound and concealed what happened within its walls from any casual observer. It had once been used for storing cotton bales before processing, but now it served a darker purpose. The 17 conspirators were chained inside, their wrists manacled to iron rings bolted into the support beams, spaced far enough apart that they couldn't reach each other but close enough that each would witness what happened to the others. Sheriff Ketchum oversaw the proceedings with the cold efficiency of a man executing necessary but distasteful business. He'd brought 6 trusted deputies, men who understood that what transpired here could never be spoken of outside this clearing. No official records would document these 3 days. No death certificates would be issued for the conspirators. They would simply cease to exist, their bodies disposed of in ways that left no trace, their names never again spoken in polite company. Thomas Bridgewater, Harold Ashford, Samuel Weatherford, and 8 other surviving plantation owners arrived at dusk on August 17. They came not as witnesses but as participants, men who'd lost families and fortunes and wanted their pound of flesh extracted slowly. They didn't speak much as they entered the barn, just stared at the 17 people chained before them, these enslaved men and women who'd dared to strike back, who'd coordinated an attack that had killed 143 of their peers. Delphine stood in the center, her face composed despite the chains that held her arms above her head. She'd known this was coming from the moment she'd poured that first measure of oleander concentrate into the gumbo. There was no version of her plan that ended any other way. She met the eyes of her captors without flinching, and in that moment, they understood that breaking her would require more than simple brutality. The first day focused on Tobias, the stable master from Hendersboro. They wanted information, names of others who might have known about the plot, details of how the conspiracy was coordinated, confirmation of who'd actually administered the poison. Tobias gave them nothing. Even as the whip opened his back in patterns that would have made a lesser man scream for mercy, even as they applied heated iron to his feet, even as they broke his fingers one by one with methodical precision, he remained silent. His only sounds were gasps of pain, never pleas for mercy, never information they could use. Judge Hendren's adult son, William, had survived the poisoning and now wielded the tools of torture with a fury born of grief. His mother, his 3 siblings, his father, all dead because this man had helped plan their murders. William wanted Tobias to beg, to recant, to show some sign that he regretted what he'd done. Instead, Tobias looked at him with something like pity and said only, "Your father whipped my daughter for spilling his tea. She was 9 years old. You think this pain compares?" They kept Tobias alive for 18 hours, pushing him to the edge of death repeatedly but pulling back, keeping him conscious so he could feel everything. The other conspirators were forced to watch, chains preventing them from looking away or closing their eyes for more than moments. This was part of the lesson, that resistance would be met with suffering beyond imagination, that every person who participated would be made an example of in ways that would haunt the enslaved population for generations. When Tobias finally died, his heart giving out from shock and blood loss, they left his body hanging from the chains as a reminder to the others of what awaited them. Then they turned their attention to Verity, the house servant who'd gathered intelligence from the Kavanaugh plantation. She lasted longer than Tobias, nearly a full day, her screams echoing through the barn as they employed techniques that left no visible marks at first but caused excruciating internal pain. Verity had been 26 years old, had survived 14 years of enslavement including countless sexual assaults by the Kavanaugh men. During one of the brief respites when they allowed her to catch her breath, she looked at her torturers and spoke with absolute clarity, "You think you're teaching us a lesson. But every enslaved person in this parish knows what we did. They know we killed you. And even if you kill us, they'll remember that it was possible. That's what terrifies you, not our deaths, but our success." They redoubled their efforts after that, determined to break her spirit before her body gave out. But Verity maintained a core of defiance that infuriated her captors precisely because it suggested she'd won something even in defeat. When she finally died on the second day, it was with a smile on her ruined face, as if she'd seen something beyond the barn that her torturers couldn't perceive. Isaiah, Ruth, Patience, each of the conspirators received individual attention, each session designed to extract maximum suffering while extracting minimal useful information. Because the truth was, the plantation owners already knew everything relevant. They knew who'd planned it, who'd executed it, how it had been coordinated. What they wanted now wasn't information but catharsis, a violent outlet for grief and rage that had no other acceptable expression. The methods employed in that barn over 3 days represented the accumulated sadism of men who'd built their fortunes on the systematic brutalization of human beings. Whips, brands, knives, heated metal, implements designed specifically to cause pain without causing immediate death. Some of the conspirators broke, begged for mercy, pleaded for quick deaths, offered to inform on others. But most maintained a stubborn silence that only enraged their captors further. They'd made peace with their fates before the first blow fell. Delphine they saved for last. She'd been the architect, the one who'd conceived the plan and recruited the others. She'd looked Margaret Ashford in the eyes every day for years while secretly planning to poison her entire family. Harold Ashford wanted personal revenge, wanted to make her suffer in ways that would erase the memory of what she'd accomplished. They started on the morning of the third day, after the other 16 conspirators had already died and their bodies had been dragged out to be burned. Delphine stood alone in the barn now, surrounded by the bloodstains of her co-conspirators, and faced her torturers with the same calm she'd maintained throughout. Harold Ashford stood before her, his face twisted with grief and fury, and demanded to know why. Why his family? Why his children? What had they done to deserve this? Delphine looked at him for a long moment before responding. "You asked me to serve dinner to your guests the same day you left my son's body in the dirt for the flies. You expected me to smile and curtsy while his blood was still under my fingernails. That's what you did. You forgot we were human." The beating that followed was savage, personal, designed to unmake her before killing her. They wanted her to recant, to apologize, to show some sign that she understood the enormity of her crime. Instead, Delphine endured with a fortitude that seemed superhuman. Even as they broke her bones, even as they carved patterns into her flesh, even as they applied tortures that had broken the strongest of her co-conspirators, she remained fundamentally unbroken in the way that mattered most, her spirit, her conviction that what she'd done was justified. It took 2 full days to kill her. Not because she was particularly physically resilient, but because her torturers kept pulling back, kept reviving her, kept finding new ways to make her suffer. They needed her to break, needed her to validate their worldview by proving that enslaved people who stepped out of their assigned roles would be crushed utterly. But Delphine never gave them that satisfaction. Her last words, spoken through broken teeth and bloodied lips on the morning of the 5th day after the poisoning, were addressed to Harold Ashford: "You'll tell people I died screaming and begging. You'll make me a lesson. But we killed 143 of you. We did that. And no matter how thoroughly you erase us, somewhere in the darkness, someone will remember." Then her heart, pushed beyond all physiological limits, finally stopped. The men in that barn stood around her corpse in silence, understanding that despite everything they'd done, despite the horrific revenge they'd extracted, Delphine had somehow won. She'd achieved what she set out to achieve and died without surrendering her dignity or her conviction. The bodies of all 17 conspirators were burned in a pyre that lasted through the night, their ashes scattered in the deepest parts of the swamp where they'd never be found. No graves were dug. No markers were placed. The barn itself was torn down within a week and the lumber burned, eliminating any physical trace of what had happened there. The clearing was left to be reclaimed by the forest. And in the slave quarters across Merricks Parish, word spread through whispers and meaningful silences about what had been done to the conspirators. The details were vague, deliberately so, but the message was clear: this is what happens when you fight back. This is the price of resistance. The white families had achieved their goal of creating a cautionary tale that would suppress future uprisings through sheer terror. But they'd also created martyrs. And martyrs, even unnamed and unrecorded ones, have a way of inspiring the very thing they were meant to prevent. The cholera story held. In the weeks following the August 17th tragedy, the Merricks Gazette published follow-up articles about improved sanitation measures and the heroic efforts of Dr. Lawrence to treat the afflicted. Neighboring parishes sent condolences and donations to help the surviving families rebuild their lives. The Louisiana governor issued a proclamation praising the resilience of Merricks Parish in the face of natural disaster. By September, the narrative had solidified into accepted fact: a tragic cholera outbreak had claimed 143 lives at an unfortunate harvest celebration. The New Orleans Daily Picayune ran the story on page 4, a brief mention of the outbreak with recommendations for preventing similar incidents. The Baton Rouge Gazette published an editorial about the importance of well water testing. Papers as far away as Richmond and Charleston picked up the story, using it as a cautionary tale about public health in the summer months. Nowhere in any of these accounts was there mention of poisoning, conspiracy, or enslaved resistance. The largest coordinated act of rebellion by enslaved people in Louisiana history had been successfully transformed into a mundane public health crisis. The cover-up required ongoing maintenance. When family members from other states arrived to collect the bodies of their deceased relatives, they were shown falsified death certificates and given careful explanations about cholera's rapid onset and high mortality rate. When insurance companies questioned the unusual number of simultaneous claims, they were provided with corroborating testimony from Dr. Lawrence and official parish documents that had been meticulously backdated. When a reporter from a northern abolitionist newspaper attempted to visit Merricks Parish 6 months later, asking pointed questions about the unusually high death toll and seeking to interview survivors, he was politely but firmly denied access and encouraged to leave Louisiana for his own safety. The 17 conspirators simply vanished from history. No death records were filed. No grave markers were placed. Their names were struck from plantation inventories without explanation. Property that had ceased to exist, rendered into absence. The enslaved people who'd known them, who'd worked alongside them, who'd shared their quarters and their lives, learned quickly not to speak their names aloud. To mention Delphine or Tobias or any of the others was to invite suspicion, to mark oneself as potentially sympathetic to their cause. But in the slave quarters after dark, in whispered conversations that the overseers couldn't hear, the story survived. It was passed from parent to child, from field hand to house servant, from plantation to plantation through the invisible networks that connected enslaved communities. The details shifted and blurred over time, numbers changed, names were forgotten or altered, the specifics of how the poisoning was accomplished became confused with other stories of resistance. But the core truth persisted: in Merricks Parish in 1847, enslaved people had struck back. They'd killed more than 100 of their oppressors in one night. And they'd been erased for it. The official records of Merricks Parish tell a peculiar story to anyone who knows where to look. The parish ledgers for August 1847 have pages missing, neat surgical removals where specific dates should be recorded. The Merricks Gazette archives, now housed in the Louisiana State Library, have a conspicuous gap between August 15 and August 25 of that year. Individual plantation records show property losses in August 1847, enslaved people who simply disappeared from inventories without notation of sale, death, or escape. Dr. Cornelius Lawrence's personal papers, donated to a historical society after his death in 1873, contain medical journals with entries from 1846 and 1848 but nothing from the summer of 1847. These absences went unnoticed for over a century. Historians compiling records of cholera outbreaks in the antebellum South noted the Merricks Parish incident but had no reason to question the official narrative. The story appeared in exactly one contemporary account outside of Louisiana, a diary entry by a traveling merchant who'd passed through the parish in late August and noted the unusual number of fresh graves and the reluctance of locals to discuss what had happened. That diary wasn't discovered until 1967, and even then, it raised no immediate red flags because the cholera explanation seemed plausible. The truth began emerging in fragments in the 1990s, when historian Dr. Patricia Kelso was researching enslaved resistance movements for her doctoral dissertation at Tulane University. She'd been examining Federal Writers Project interviews conducted with formerly enslaved people in the 1930s when she found a curious account from an elderly woman named Bessie Carmichael, who'd been born in Merricks Parish in 1852. Carmichael had mentioned, almost as an aside, that her grandmother used to tell stories about the great poisoning when the masters all died in one night and the ones who did it got burned in the swamp. Kelso initially dismissed this as folklore or confused memory, but something about the specificity nagged at her. She began cross-referencing Louisiana parish records, looking for any mass casualty event in the 1840s that might have been reinterpreted through oral tradition. That's when she discovered the gaps in the Merricks Parish records, the missing Gazette issues, the cholera outbreak that left no medical specimens, no quarantine orders, no secondary infections beyond the initial incident, all highly unusual for a genuine cholera epidemic. She spent 4 years researching, tracking down private letters from surviving family members, comparing death records across parishes, analyzing plantation inventories for anomalies. What she uncovered was a conspiracy of silence that had lasted 148 years. Her findings were published in 1996 in the Journal of Southern Historical Studies, an academic quarterly with a circulation of approximately 3,000 subscribers, mostly other historians and graduate students. The article, titled The Merricks Parish Incident, Coordinated Slave Resistance and Historical Erasure in Antebellum Louisiana, presented compelling evidence that the 1847 cholera outbreak was actually a mass poisoning orchestrated by enslaved people. Kelso had identified Delphine by name through cross-referencing plantation inventories and had traced the outline of the conspiracy through fragments of oral history. She documented the systematic erasure of evidence and argued that this represented one of the most successful historical cover-ups in American history. The article received modest academic attention. It was cited in a few subsequent papers on enslaved resistance. A chapter in a 2003 book about hidden histories of the antebellum South referenced Kelso's work. But it never broke through into popular consciousness. No major newspaper picked up the story. No documentary filmmaker sought to dramatize it. The textbooks used in schools continued to teach about Nat Turner's rebellion and John Brown's raid without mentioning that a larger and more coordinated act of resistance had occurred in Merricks Parish and been successfully buried. Why? Perhaps because acknowledging the Merricks Parish poisoning requires confronting uncomfortable truths about how thoroughly those in power can shape historical memory. It forces the question, if this atrocity was successfully hidden for 150 years, what else don't we know? How many other acts of resistance were erased? How many other Delphines and Tobiases were tortured to death and burned in swamps with no one to remember their names? The clearing where the barn once stood has been reclaimed entirely by the Louisiana wilderness. Cypress trees grow where 17 people were tortured to death, their roots reaching down into soil that holds no trace of the ashes scattered there. The parish commons where 268 people were poisoned is now a public park with a historical marker that mentions the tragic cholera outbreak of 1847, without questioning the official narrative. The plantations where Delphine and her co-conspirators lived and planned their rebellion have been converted into luxury homes and bed and breakfasts that advertise Southern charm and plantation hospitality. In 2018, a group of local activists attempted to have a memorial erected in Merricks Parish acknowledging what Dr. Kelso's research had uncovered. The proposal was quietly rejected by the parish council with no public explanation. The official story remains unchanged in local historical records. The cholera outbreak of 1847 is still taught to schoolchildren as an unfortunate public health crisis, a reminder of the importance of sanitation and clean water. Delphine's grave has no marker. Her name appears in no monument. The parish where she lived and worked and orchestrated the largest coordinated resistance by enslaved people in Louisiana history has forgotten her completely, or rather, has chosen to keep her forgotten. That choice continues every day that the true story remains buried, every time a tour guide leads visitors through a restored plantation without mentioning the people who fought back, every time a history textbook glosses over the systematic erasure of black resistance. But in the slave narratives archived at the Library of Congress, in the oral histories collected by the Federal Writers Project, in the whispered stories passed down through generations of descendants, fragments of the truth survive. Delphine and her 17 co-conspirators achieved something extraordinary. They struck back against their oppressors with devastating effectiveness. Their reward was torture, death, and erasure from history. Yet somehow, against all odds and despite every effort to bury them, they're still here. Still haunting the gaps in the parish records. Still present in the conspicuous absences that mark where truth was replaced with lies. The silence that was meant to erase them has instead become their monument. Every missing page in the Merricks Gazette archives, every gap in the parish ledgers, every uncomfortable question that goes unanswered when historians ask what really happened in August 1847, these are the markers of their resistance. And every time someone discovers the truth and refuses to let it be forgotten again, Delphine and the others win a small victory against the forces that tried to unmake them. This story was meant to die in that barn in 1847. For 178 years, it almost succeeded. The people who orchestrated this cover-up understood something fundamental: controlling history is the ultimate form of power. They couldn't erase what Delphine did, 143 of them died to prove that, but they could erase the memory of it, and that was almost as effective. Almost. The fact that you're watching this video right now, that you know Delphine's name, that you understand what really happened in Merricks Parish, means the cover-up has finally failed. But it only fails if you do something about it. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video. Leave a comment telling me what you think about this story and what other historical atrocities you believe were successfully buried. Because I guarantee you, this isn't the only one. This is just the one we've managed to uncover. How many others are still waiting in the gaps of the historical record? How many other Delphines fought back and were erased? Your engagement is the only thing standing between this story and another 178 years of silence. Don't let them bury it again.